Good.
Okay, great. Okay, bienvenue. Thank you everyone for coming to the 31st event of Disrupting Disruptions, the feminist and accessible publishing, communications, and technologies practices speaker and workshop series. This is also our second event of 2021. I'm Dr. Alex Ketchum, and I'm a professor of feminist and social justice studies at McGill and the organizer of this series. The Feminist and Accessible Publishing, Communications, and Technologies Practices Speaker and Workshop Series seeks to bring together scholars, creators, and people in industry working at the intersections of digital humanities, computer science, feminist studies, disability studies, communication studies, LGBTQ studies, history, and critical race theory. Season 2 will build on the themes of the earlier series, but will also ask questions about sustainability, maintenance, right to repair, and the power of speculative futures. Past series speakers Suzanne Kite and Jess McLean have pointed to the physical and material impacts of the digital world. While the events this semester are virtual, everything that we do is tied to the land and the space that we are on. Furthermore, as the series seeks to draw attention to power relations that have been invisibilized, it is important to acknowledge Canada's long colonial history and current political practices. The series is affiliated with the Institute for Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies of McGill University. We are currently located in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, on unceded Kanien'kehá:ka territory. Furthermore, the ongoing organizing efforts by the Wet'suwet'en people at the Unistoten camp make clear the ever-present and ongoing colonial violence in Canada. Interwoven with this history of colonization is one of enslavement and racism. This university's namesake, James McGill, enslaved Black and Indigenous peoples. It was in part from the money he acquired through these violent acts that McGill University was founded. These histories are here with us in this space and inform the conversations we have today. I encourage you to look up the lands and the histories of those lands that you are presently on. This series was made possible thanks to our many funders. A special thanks to the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the IGSF, Milieu, the Indigenous Futures Lab, the Intersectionality Research Hub, MUA, the Black Feminist Futures Working Group, Cinema Politica, and more. Please check out our website and social media for a list of upcoming talks. We have 12 this semester. Pretty much all of them are on Wednesdays. Next week, on February 3rd, is Eleanor Carmi on media distortions. February 10th is Yeshi Milner on abolishing big data and data for Black lives. And we have many more. We have videos of past events and information of future events shared on our website and social media. All of our events are free to attend, open to the public, and while virtual, professionally captioned. Thank you today to our captionist, Nicole. For this event, recording is enabled, so the event can be posted on YouTube later and embedded on our website. Don't worry, only the speakers will be shown in the video. We also have the Q&A option available here in Zoom. So throughout the talk, you may type in your questions in the Q&A box, and there will be some time at the end for Deb to answer them. Now for today's event. I now have the pleasure of introducing Deborah Raji. She is a Mozilla Fellow interested in topics of algorithmic auditing and evaluation. She has worked closely with the Algorithmic Justice League initiative on several award-winning projects to highlight cases of bias in computer vision. She has also worked with Google's ethical AI team and has been a research fellow at the Partnership on AI and AI Now Institute at New York University, working on various projects to operationalize ethical considerations in machine learning engineering practice. You may have also seen Deb appear in our previous screening of the film Coded Bias. Thank you everyone for participating. I look forward to the presentation. Take it away.
Hi, that was a great introduction. Thank you so much for that. And thanks for inviting me. I really enjoyed even watching the talks from past sessions, and I'm looking forward to this series as it continues, and I'm glad to be a part of it. So today I'll be talking about something that's been a very sort of interesting challenge for me in particular, which is this challenge of audits, accountability, and algorithmic justice. Oh, let me see if I can. So it's very clear to a lot of those that work in this space that something is happening. And by this something, It's this sort of public consciousness around these issues of algorithmic justice. So algorithmic justice, or that term, is something that was, popularized by Joy Buolamwini, who, as a PhD student at the MIT Media Lab, called out situations where algorithms were perpetuating unjust outcomes for individuals. So here's a picture of 3 students that were declared victims of an algorithm. Due to COVID, these students couldn't sit for their A-level exams. And as a result of that, they had algorithmically assigned grades. And this is something that happened in the UK, but also with IB exams in the US and Canada. The result of that algorithmic decision was that students in lower income regions were given lower grades. So we're pretty much downgraded to adjust for, historical trends in their grades and other features fed into the algorithm, while students in private schools, for example, where typically, the average of a particular region was higher, the students would get an upgrade. So the students kind of came into the streets and protested en masse about the injustice of that algorithmic decision. And if you're paying attention to the news recently, you'll know that this is not a very isolated case. So that was last summer, but just a couple months ago, we saw the situation of residents at Stanford University's hospital protesting at an algorithm that had deprioritized them in terms of vaccine delivery. We saw a recent case of Deliveroo drivers claiming a discriminatory algorithm adjusting their wages inappropriately. We've seen a situation of an algorithm, deprioritizing Black patients in hospitals throughout California. And we've seen situations of algorithms, disproportionately giving high risk scores to Black defendants in criminal justice cases. So this is not something new. It's been going on for a couple of years now, but there's this increasing crescendo of cases that we're seeing where people are incredibly uncomfortable and they're feeling that these algorithms are now put in a position to make decisions about them that they can question as unjust decisions. So today I'm going to talk about why it's been so difficult, even though we are increasingly aware of this injustice, to actually hold these algorithms accountable. So I'm going to start with some important reminders, things that I think should be kept in mind throughout this entire presentation. Then I'm going to talk about, what I mean by algorithmic accountability. What does it actually mean to be able to demand any kind of retribution for injustice? And then I'm going to talk about the 3 major challenges. So the first one is that of engineering responsibility, which is a lot of the work I do. And then I'm going to discuss other challenges in other areas that other people work on and just highlight that very briefly. So I'm going to start with some important reminders. And these 3 images for me are sort of a good visual summary of those reminders. So the first is, something that I am frustrated with the documentary, The Social Dilemma for, which is, a lot of the algorithms that cause a lot of harm, that perpetuate a lot of injustice, are often not the algorithms that you can just opt out of. So in The Social Dilemma, a great documentary, they kind of go over, how algorithms and devices for social media apps, recommendation engines, for example, exacerbate a bunch of issues. And their position is to just turn off your phone, to take a step back, opt out of engaging with that. But when it comes to algorithms that perpetuate a lot of the injustice that we deal with or we encounter, we're studying, these are not algorithms you can opt out of. These are systems that are imposed, and they don't always have users that intersect with the affected population. What I mean is that you might have an algorithm being used by a hospital administrator or purchased by a doctor affecting a patient. You might have an algorithm purchased by a teacher or a principal affecting a student. At times, the affected population is not the same population as the user population or the consumer. And as a result of that, you can have situations where a company might not be incentivized to act in the best interest of this non-user affected population, or a situation where a user or that affected population might be in conflict. But more importantly, or most importantly, it's beyond this individual dilemma of, do I engage or do I not engage? It's actually a more systematic issue where you don't have that option at all. The second reminder is that of a real world full of Roombas. So I don't know if anyone has sort of seen press stories of Sophia the robot. It's this very humanoid robot-like being, very glossy, very fancy looking thing. And that's really the vision of what people have in their mind when they think of robotics. They think of these sci-fi robotic things, but the most widely deployed and impactful robot in the modern age is the Roomba. The Roomba is in millions of homes throughout the US, but when you see it, it's very simple. It's not very complicated. But this is really the nature of a lot of the algorithms that are perpetuating some of the injustices we're battling today. Real world algorithms are often quite simple, not very complicated technically, and they're deployed at scale. So to the order of hundreds of thousands to millions impacted. So for reference, a self-driving car might affect, at most, 1,000 cities, might be deployed in 1,000 cities. We're talking about algorithms deployed on, hundreds of millions of people. And then the other reminder is that impact exists outside of the imagination. So, none of the algorithms I'm going to discuss today are hypothetical, and nothing I'm going to say is rhetorical. Everything I'm going to talk about are, real systems, real products that affect real people, and the real people that are impacted by these deployments. So the outcomes we're trying to mitigate and control for and take charge of are outcomes that are significant and relevant and impactful and meaningful. So now that we've gotten those reminders out of the way, I'm going to very briefly explain what algorithmic accountability is. And I apologize for this not so clear diagram. But the TLDR here is that you have this, the sort of conceptualization, and this is a great sort of definition that I borrowed from Waranga's really great survey paper on this topic of trying to define algorithmic accountability. But the TLDR is that you have this actor character and this forum character, and the actor is the one that really holds a lot of the power. So they have the information, they have the authority to take action about a situation, and the forum is the affected population or the group that is most directly experiencing the impact of the actor's decision making. So the forum is in a position to sort of judge the effectiveness of the actor's actions, and based off of their judgment, we want to see real consequences. So what this roughly translates to is that, there's so many involved stakeholders. There's the government, there's policymakers, there's product developers, there's the affected population, there's advocacy groups, and we need to pretty much figure out who's responsible. And once we figure out who's responsible, we need to figure out who needs to take action and who is actually held accountable. If an algorithmic product causes harm, who can we point to either alleviate that harm, compensate victims, or improve the situation for everyone involved? So these are the kinds of questions we're asking ourselves when we discuss algorithmic accountability. So now I'm going to go into sort of the meat of this, which is a discussion of the major challenges that I see. This is a bit of a rant talk in the sense that I will talk about, especially for the first challenge, I will talk about things that we have been working on. I will discuss our work, but I also really want to use this talk as an opportunity to present some of the ongoing challenges we're facing, some of the things that we don't really know the answer to yet, and we're still scratching our heads over. So these three major challenges are pretty much defined with respect to stakeholders. So the challenge of engineering responsibility is pretty much asking, how can we hold those that build the algorithm to account? If there's something wrong, inherently wrong with the algorithm, if it's built in the wrong way, if it's making bad decisions as a product, how do we hold that engineer or the sort of group responsible for building that algorithm to account? The second challenge is that I call the challenge of operator accountability. So how do we hold those that are making use of the algorithm to account? So if you have, like I mentioned, a hospital that makes purchase of a vendor product, how do we hold that hospital to account? Or school that makes purchase of, an ed tech tool, how do we hold the school to account? So those making use of the algorithm, how do we understand how they contribute to harms and hold them to account? And then the last challenge is a really tricky one, which is the challenge of structural harms. So we have, historical legacies and norms that feed into some of the harms perpetuated by algorithms. How do we remedy those situations, and how do we deal with that? So these are the three sort of categories of challenges that we're facing. And I'm going to break down, what we've learned about each of these and what's so difficult about actually getting results for those that are affected in each of these scenarios. So the first is the challenge of engineering responsibility. So that, like I mentioned before, how do we hold those building these tools in a way that hurts people? How do we hold them accountable? So first, I'm going to briefly explain what I mean by engineering responsibility. So, some might have heard of some of these examples, especially Canadians in the room. You might recognize the Quebec Bridge, built in 1904. It was the longest cantilever bridge. I think it still is, but it had there was a tragic collapse in the early 1900s, and it killed about 75 of the workers working on the bridge at the time. And the lead engineer, Theodore Cooper, was actually called out by name in a Royal Commissioned report about that collapse and held accountable. And it was really a landmark case of, engineering responsibility. In fact, I actually did my undergrad at the University of Toronto in engineering, and we all got an iron ring, sort of in commiseration of the fact that, as a reminder of our responsibility as engineers to do a good job and to do due diligence when we build things, to reflect on the importance of our role in building products that are, stable and robust. So this story of Theodore Cooper is really a landmark narrative or a classic example of what it means to be a responsible and trustworthy engineer. So the other example is an example I really like, where Ralph Nader, he's sort of an activist for consumer protection in the US, and he wrote a great book called Unsafe at Any Speed. And in that book, he gives this example of the Chevrolet Corvair and how that car was just, a huge mess of engineering. It did not steer properly. It had, horrible miscalculations in its design that made it incredibly unsafe to drive. And he uses it as an example of, people that had constructed this artifact without any regard for the safety or the well-being of those that would be making use of it. So it's another sort of classic example of the fact that those that create these artifacts need to actually do a good job building these things. So in AI, we actually see this happen all the time. I'll give some sort of familiar examples. So one is with the MIDAS unemployment system in Michigan. This was an algorithm that was meant to detect unemployment fraud. Unfortunately, this was an incredibly poorly implemented algorithm. Later on, it was found out that, through a migration with a legacy system, there were all of these mistakes in the data, missing data that was input incorrectly. And a review found that the system actually had something like over an 80% error rate. In this case in particular, accusing about 85% of the results of fraud incorrectly. So a false accusation of fraud can land you, pulled into this whole bureaucratic system, pulled into the criminal justice system unnecessarily. It was a huge scandal. And it was because of an algorithm that was prematurely deployed, but also one that really didn't work. It was poorly constructed, and there were a lot of reflections that were meant to happen in the process that didn't. Another sort of more tragic example was the fatal crash because of Uber's self-driving car. So this was a situation where Uber was testing out its self-driving car system, and they did not account for scenarios where you might have an individual jaywalking across the road. So as a result of that, the car itself did not stop on time and actually hit that pedestrian, and the test driver who was in the car at the time was distracted. So this was another situation where through the design of the car, the test driver could be distracted by virtue of how it was designed. It wasn't designed to keep the hands on the wheel or the eyes on the road, for example. But also, that use case, that feature apparently was something that, had been discussed as an edge case, but was not actually implemented. So this is, again, another sort of situation where, in terms of who's responsible, there's some accountability here for those that constructed the algorithm. And then the case that I'm most familiar with, because I was involved in this, is the gender shade study and the subsequent work we did, where we evaluated commercially deployed facial recognition systems on different demographic groups. So darker male, darker female, lighter male, and lighter female. And we found that these products, which were deployed products, at this time, Microsoft had several clients in law enforcement. And later on, we would evaluate Amazon with similar results that was actively pitching, their product to ICE and to law enforcement. And they would be getting, 65% accuracy at best, 79% accuracy on darker females. And that gap in performance revealed that they were not actually evaluating their products on this demographic. Within 7 months, all three of these companies in the initial study were able to update their performance to do much better on darker female faces, indicating that the initial audit just revealed a lack of oversight or thinking about how to build these tools. So again, an example of poor engineering responsibility or design. And to speak to the role of those constructing these systems and their lack of thinking when they do these things, is with the PPB data set, which was what we used to evaluate the performance of these facial recognition tools. They were pretty evenly split between male and female and darker and lighter representation. That's how we were able to build the benchmark. And when you compare that benchmark to all the other benchmarks developed at the time, you can see that other benchmarks at the time were, up to 80% male, up to 90% lighter skinned. So it was really a standout data set at the time, revealing the lack of conscious effort to equitably evaluate these data sets by the engineering teams building these tools at the time. The other thing too is the National Institute of Standards and Technology sort of independently evaluated many more products and found that on average, most products were up to 100 times more likely to misidentify Asian and African American people than white people. So this is again, demonstrative of the fact that this product just didn't work in many cases for certain people. And again, there's with facial recognition, there's even more evidence that this doesn't just apply for those particular tasks, but also other tasks. If you're wearing a mask, a lot of algorithms will fail. There's also been evidence of this kind of biased performance on the evaluation of facial expression in certain data sets. So again, these are just products that don't work. And further evidence of that was also with respect to some actually deployed pilot studies. So when you actually, with facial recognition, people would, take the product on real world data, not staged data or well cut, well framed data, but data in the wild, and they would get things like MTA had a pilot study where they had a 0% accuracy rate, meaning they could not properly identify any of the faces in their pilot study. And then the UK police revealed an 81% error rate, which is horrible. And an evaluation of 11 commercial systems found a similar situation where based off of how the image was acquired, you would have horrible performance. So, engineering responsibility is really the situation where you have the person that's constructing the system making a bunch of mistakes. And because this is actually a question that I've been thinking about for a very long time, I actually have some answers with respect to what we can do. So I'm going to very quickly go over those different strategies of, what do you do when you have a situation where someone's constructed a system without any care for how it's going to affect someone, and as a result of that has done a shoddy work constructing the system. So like I mentioned before, with these cases of engineering responsibility, you have a specific target usually. So you're thinking about a specific product and you have a specific context of who it affects and in which context the nature of the context in which that person's affected. But you also have expectations for performance. You have the things that the product claims to be able to do. And then you also understand, you have a sense of how that product will fall short. So given those conditions, we have some ideas of how to actually think about engineering responsibility, how to detect it, and how to hold those building these systems accountable. So the first way to do that is with an audit, from the outside or the inside. So, when I talk about an internal audit versus an external audit, an internal audit would be by pretty much anyone hired by, the company that constructs the algorithm. So, these are people that have direct access to the system. These are people that get to update the system before deployment. It's usually a set of employees, and they're focusing on compliance and quality control. When I'm talking about an external audit, I'm talking about, people really peering from the outside in. So they have indirect or consumer level access to the system. They're not paid by the company in any way. They're outside actors, usually looking at the product post deployment, and they're usually executed by an independent third party, and their focus is not on quality control or the success of the product. They can care less. They're focused on protecting a particular represented group. So an example of external auditors would be the FDA in the US, ACLU, the Government Accountability Office in the US. So the idea of algorithmic auditing has been happening for a very long time, especially external algorithmic auditing. Here's a couple papers from the last couple years, as early as 2014, of audit studies that had happened in especially the human computer interface kind of research community. So it wasn't anything new. However, with gender shades, there were sort of specific directions that were made to address particular issues. And I can't go into detail about every single one of these points, but it will suffice to say, and I encourage you to sort of read our paper, Actionable Auditing, where we go into detail about each of these challenges and how we looked at other disciplines to try to think about ways to address these issues. But the TLDR here is that there were consistent issues of the benchmark itself being biased, or the evaluation process being skewed in terms of the results that it would give. There were issues with being able to access the audit target itself. So as someone from the outside, how do you actually get a glimpse at what the audit results what the algorithm is doing, and where the algorithm is in an entire more complicated system. There's also this issue of public pressure. So it's very difficult to get companies to care once you had the audit result, or get the public to care about that audit result. And then finally, dealing with hostile corporate reactions. Once you point out something that's wrong with a company's product, they get very upset with you, and it's very difficult to manage. So we did an audit, like I mentioned earlier, the gender shades audit on different commercial facial recognition products. And here's the follow-up audit we did a year later with Amazon and Kairos, again revealing that performance on darker females was significantly worse than that on lighter males. The result of this audit really was, by virtue of how we designed this audit, we were able to circumvent a lot of the issues I had mentioned before. So, we were able to release it in a way to get a certain amount of publicity. We were able to strategize around setting up multiple named targets, so that we were able to set up a competitive atmosphere that would encourage a certain amount of attention and pressure on these companies to take action. So as an accountability mechanism, the audit actually was quite effective in doing that. But we still encountered very specific issues as a result of that. So one issue that arose right away was the Kairos, which was one of the companies we audited, set up a paywall immediately, which was devastating. Obviously, it made it very difficult for anyone after us to be able to actually audit the system and access the system. So this question of access became an issue because companies can just put up walls to prevent audits from actually happening. Another really big issue in terms of actually holding these companies accountable through audits was their responses. So, once we raised these issues of disparate performance for facial recognition systems, we had this challenge where the companies would respond strangely. In the case of Microsoft, they said, okay, well, you're right. We don't have a well-representative training set. So we're going to build, the biggest data set full of, as many diverse faces as possible. And at the time, it seemed like a good idea, but it also revealed a lot of challenges where they weren't able to get consent for those faces. So it opened up Pandora's box of all these issues with respect to that response. Also, not necessarily directly Face++, but CloudWalk, another Chinese sort of surveillance company inspired by sort of the press around the situation with Face++, attempted to purchase, images of, Zimbabwe residents. So in order to diversify their data set. So you can see how like it escalated to the point of companies just attempting to beat the benchmark in order to respond to the critique of the audit, rather than actually truly reflecting in a way that would hold them accountable in a more long-term way. The other thing as well is that audits are incredibly specific. So, we audit a particular task, a particular demographic, a particular company. Later on in a third follow-up study, we found that although, Microsoft, for example, was able to, minimize the gap between its performance on darker females and other demographic groups to about 0.25% on the gender classification task, on a different task, which is maybe, let's say, age prediction, Microsoft still had a huge gap between the sort of dominantly performing group and the darker female subgroup. So they were still sort of failing to perform well on this demographic for other tasks that were not covered in our audit, which was unfortunate. The other thing that we realized was that our audit didn't necessarily account for, when you're evaluating the performance of a system, you're not necessarily accounting for situations where the whole premise of the product is, pseudoscientific. So there were a lot of situations or products that we hadn't really properly reflected on in terms of the task, like, what is the value of the task of gender classification? What is the value of predicting criminality or hireability? Is that even a possibility? So there was a lot of these issues that arose once we attempted to pursue accountability through the avenue of an audit. One positive thing that did happen or did come out of all of this was Joy sort of, at the Algorithmic Justice League, we sort of set up this safe days pledge where we're able to, or where we attempted to address some of these issues by having companies that would respond to our audit results. Also, we encourage them to also sign this pledge to pursue solutions to that challenge in a way that could perhaps, facilitate transparency, maintain dignity in the rights of those affected and such. So the second part of this is, what can we do? What else can we do? Or what else did we try? And the other thing that we tried was auditing from the inside. So here is sort of a very typical, a diagram from a typical sort of paradigm for algorithmic evaluation, algorithmic audits, for audits in general, internal audits, where you have these three lines of defense, meaning you have multiple teams within the company that are reflecting on how to protect that company from liability. And the sort of third line of defense, after you deal with sort of the people building the tool, or the quality assurance team or the risk management team, you have this internal audit team which can kind of operate independently within the company to be able to assess products internally before they're deployed. So this was a lot of the work that I did with colleagues at Google, and the first sort of step in that process, especially in the field at large, was this idea of transparency and communication through data documentation. So internally, opening up the channels of communication between different internal stakeholders as a way of accountability. So if I'm building a tool, if I'm building a device, then I can actually record different decisions that I'm making as I'm training this model, as I'm developing this algorithm, so that I can then communicate those decisions to other stakeholders that are interested in that outcome. So the first sort of iteration of these were around data. So, where am I getting my data from? What's data provenance? What are the details of my data? And these are sort of some examples in terms of data sheets, NLP data statements, and data licenses. That was really the first wave of documentation processes. But later on, there's a great project I was fortunate to participate in called Model Cards for Model Reporting. And here's an example of what a model card is, where we pretty much condensed the top questions that we would need to reflect on in order to communicate to other stakeholders. So an overview of what the model is about, considerations, use cases, really trying to say, what is it about this model that I can condense into, a one-pager or two-pager that I can distribute. And the first model card at Google was by the Perspective API team, released on their GitHub, and anyone can kind of just check it out. And I think it's also featured in the paper. But it was really an example of communicating not just internally, but also having a version of that communicated externally as well, as a mode of accountability and transparency with a broader audience. And the most sort of recent iteration of the model cards product is this idea of automating certain parts of the model card. So trying to automate certain evaluation calculations and automatically fill out parts of the model card to make it that much easier for people to discuss amongst themselves, at least internally, the details of their model and the decisions they were making about their model. And then, finally, sort of one of the bigger projects I did was sort of this idea of, while we have these documents that we've already developed on model cards and data sheets, but internal auditing is very much a thing. Like I mentioned, it's a practice in financial auditing, it's a practice in the medical space, in the aerospace space. The idea of having a team internally to assess and to evaluate the model as a mode of accountability is a very kind of well-known or well-documented idea. So we were able to think of other documents and other tools that were used in other disciplines to help really flesh out, what we would later sort of, and this is just an example of one of the tools that we had pulled in from aerospace. I don't think I have time to go into it, but we would really use that to flesh out a whole framework to say, like, we're not just going to document the outcome of the model by the engineer and then have it, have documentation be this step, this pre-deployment step, but we actually need a set of documents developed throughout the model development cycle. As you're building the product, from the beginning, from conceptualization all the way to the end, what do we need to capture about this model? So that SMACTR framework was really sort of a very robust framework around an attempt to say, how do we actually close this accountability gap between what this engineering team knows and what everyone else needs to know inside the company to really hold them accountable to certain standards. The other thing I wanted to mention too was about ML, for those that are interested, kind of collected a lot of these papers together and wrote a nice report summarizing a lot of the documentation and internal audit efforts across different companies. So Partnership on AI, for those that don't know, is this partnership of a lot of the major tech companies. So Google's involved, Facebook's involved, Amazon, Salesforce, et cetera. And they were able to convene all of these different companies that were doing their independent thing, trying to set up their internal audit infrastructure and actually pull everyone together to have a conversation. And annotation actually ended up being a huge topic. So this idea of documentation was a recurring theme that everyone at all these different companies were trying to do. Now for the challenges. So, one of the really big downsides of the internal audit route to accountability is the fact that ultimately a company is a profit-making machine. A company is meant to sell products, and unfortunately, when there's a situation where an internal audit member or a member of the team that's hired even for accountability purposes says something that contradicts the company's product and roadmap, then there's conflict. And that's really what we saw with the unfortunate firing of Timnit Gebru at Google, where she was speaking out about the dangers of the deployment of large language models, and Google sort of very disrespectfully dismissed her as a result of that. So this is really, for me, a stark example of one of the core limitations of an internal audit. An internal audit team is ultimately hired by that company, and that limits their ability to be able to fully critique to the point of saying, we cannot release this product, or we must sacrifice profit for the sake of protecting this affected population. That becomes incredibly stark when that affected population, like I mentioned, is not the user. So in instances where the affected population is the customer, is the user, there could be an argument for why a company might care to invest in acting better. But it's really difficult to hold a company to account when those are separate populations. And then the other sort of thing that arose here is this challenge of just the complexity of these systems and these concepts. So, what is an unbiased data set? I have never encountered an unbiased data set. There's always some level of bias. There's always a represented worldview in every data set, and the bias comes from all these different sources. So, even internally managing that engineering process and mapping that out internally can be incredibly challenging and can easily get quite complex. So that's another really difficult thing, where even to get something as simple as model cards off the ground was really challenging. People couldn't remember, if they had trained that model based off of, trained that model years ago off of a certain data set, or if it was a data set that they had combined with someone else's data set. It became very tricky very quickly. And that was something that people really struggled with. The other thing, I see I'm like running out of time, so I'm going to try to rush through these a little bit quicker. But the other thing that we can try to do is regulate. And with facial recognition, what that meant was this campaign to ban police use of face surveillance tools specifically. So it was this very specific use case that we understood to be problematic. And, Fight for the Future and ACLU, we worked with them to sort of campaign for this ban of this tool that we understood was completely dysfunctional and ineffective for, the advertised use case. So we understood that facial recognition worked poorly on darker skinned individuals, and that made it completely unacceptable for police use, especially for police surveillance. So it was a kind of a clear argument for this particular use case, and regulation was a very clear path forward. And at the time that we had released our papers, literally after Gender Shades was released, and then about a year later, after Actionable Auditing was released, you would see all these headlines of, Amazon and Microsoft sort of, and IBM also later on would sort of, the leaders would release these statements saying that they were pro legislation, and they would be talking about it, so positively. Saying, please regulate us and things like that. So it was a really interesting turn of events in that moment. But then later on, the sort of longer the fight took, we realized that really behind the scenes, things were a lot more complicated. As these companies were asking to be regulated, they were also sending in, dozens of lobbyists for every single bill, every single facial recognition bill that entered the floor in Congress. At the same time, they would be quietly lobbying different municipalities that they would want to keep facial recognition in, keep a facial recognition ban from. And then they were also forging relationships with different members of Congress. And here you have, unfortunately, Kamala Harris implicated with an Amazon lobbyist. The other thing as well is that the idea of a shareholder regulation was also kind of out the window. And this came up in Amazon's case, where the shareholders put up a vote, upheld by the SEC to vote down Amazon's sale of facial recognition. And unfortunately, the SEC allowed the vote to occur, but unfortunately, Amazon rigorously campaigned for its shareholders to vote to keep facial recognition as a product that it would offer. And then the sort of final thing that we can try to do is recall. So, a product recall is this idea of, like I was mentioning with the Chevrolet car, a car whose brakes don't work, where it becomes a danger to those that, purchase that item. You need to recall it. You need to take it off the market. And it's really interesting to me when we have, a hospital prioritization algorithm affecting 100 million people, systematically biased against people of color and dysfunctional in a particular way. and everyone just allowing that to continue, allowing that to happen, rather than acting in the way that you would if you had a car whose brakes didn't work. You would immediately pull it off of the market. So the idea of a recall is not, pulling a dysfunctional product immediately off the market once you realize that that dysfunction is, fatal or harmful. It's not a new idea. It's existed, as long as we've had products out there. And it's something that we can use as sort of a legal strategy to hold these systems accountable. And this is something that we actually saw with facial recognition later on, especially post George Floyd, and for that particular case of face surveillance by police, where with George Floyd protests that happened in the States, there was this awareness that happened around the dangers of police use of facial recognition, and suddenly it became a completely unacceptable situation for this technology to be dysfunctional within. The danger and the fatal nature of the impact of this technology became very clear immediately, and as a result of that, there was this push for those products to be pulled off of the market, while the previous position was sort of, oh, we want regulation to be happening, and we're going to continue selling this while the conversation for regulation happens. And that quickly shifted into a position of, oh, even while these nuanced conversations are happening, we need to immediately pull this off of the market. It's completely inappropriate for it to be sold in this moment. So that was a moment that happened over the summer with IBM, Amazon, and Microsoft all pulling their products off the market. The challenge, though, here is that it was a long fight. It was a 2-year fight. It was very difficult, very tiring. And obviously, that's a huge challenge with that strategy of recalls. It takes forever to convince a company to pull their product off of the market. The other thing as well is that there's loopholes to every recall. So, there's a 1-year moratorium that Amazon put in place for police sales, but that didn't prevent them from, running their facial recognition product on these smart doorbells and, partnering with police for that product. So there was a lot of these situations that we saw. I have no time left, so I'm gonna, in 2 minutes, just go over the last 2 points, which are very quick. This is sort of the second challenge of operator accountability. So, those that are making use of these tools irresponsibly, again, these operator accountability and structural harms are things that I don't work on. So I have, no strategy on on what we can do, but I want to just highlight those challenges really quickly. So, operator accountability is the situation where you have someone that purchases the product and they have no guidance on how to use it. And this happens with police all the time with facial recognition. There's reported cases of them taking sketches of individuals and running that through the facial recognition system to get a match. There was a case that Amazon was sort of saying that they would use, that they enforce particular thresholds on their clients, and that not really playing out appropriately because the clients had no idea what a threshold was. So just the misuse or misunderstanding of how to actually use these tools happens all the time. There's also the situation of, malicious users, landlords that want to use facial recognition to harass tenants, police using facial recognition to harass tenants or to target minority groups. And then there's also this issue with operators around disclosure. So you have people that will sort of take a facial recognition tool and use it without anyone's consent. So no disclosure to the public that they've used this tool. And that was actually the impetus for New York City's Post Act, where they actually by law required the police department to reveal all the surveillance technologies they were making use of, because there was at that point no public information about this. And the very sort of last challenge is that of structural harms. So sort of very briefly, structural harms, it's pretty much this idea of, although you have these cars that don't break, that need to be pulled off the market immediately, and that's a very easy conversation. They also have the fact that, cars in general are not good for the environment. They flatten our cities. There's these sort of structural, established infrastructure that makes it very difficult for you to just, abolish cars. So this is something that we feel or that we see with biased algorithms as well. We see that media and societal biases, for example, just the way that the media works around advertising for skin products, affects what we see for the results of, beautiful skin when we search for that in Google Images. And then also, the legal infrastructure that we have makes it only possible to sue particular companies in particular situations of housing and employment, but not in other situations. And that becomes very challenging. And then also the fact that legally, a lot of the work that we do as external auditors is also under attack. So Christian Sandvig is a scholar sort of working in the same vein as me and Joy on this algorithmic accountability work. And him and the ACLU recently went to the Supreme Court, the federal court, to sort of defend big data discrimination studies from violating federal anti-hacking laws. And Julia Anwin sort of had a similar campaign. She runs this sort of investigative journalist group that, again, acts as these external auditors. And they also had to really campaign and fight the system to be able to do this audit work. I'm not going to get into that or this, but I sort of wanted to end here with this point around, really reflecting on who's affected by this and how challenging it can be for the intersection of those impacted to also be those that are most vulnerable. In the case of, this A-level system that I shared the image of at the beginning, these were kids, and you had hundreds and thousands of them affected by this. No level of recourse or avenue to really change their situation. So it was a really challenging. It was a really big challenge to sort of be able to address the injustice that they felt coming from that situation, and it was horrible that we, as a community, did not have an adequate toolbox of accountability measures to really address all the different actors involved. And yeah, that's sort of where I wanted to end with this point around, if it doesn't work for everyone, it really doesn't work at all. You have these systems that are, poorly constructed, that are completely misused, that are embedded in these societal and historical biases. And we really need to figure out a way to hold those responsible to account. And really protect ourselves from that false claim of this is something that works when it is clearly something that doesn't work universally or in a way that's universally beneficial. Okay, and that I will end now just so we have enough time for questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much for such a fantastic talk. I just want to remind audience members that you can ask us questions in the Q&A box. We won't read your name, we'll just read the first name, or if you want to be anonymous, you can be anonymous. And Deb, the discussion that you had of the hostile corporate reactions and the move of centering like a paywall really stood out. And so this brings us really nicely into the first audience member question. Giselle asks, with many third-party auditors and different metrics used, how do consumers trust one auditor over another? And would a standardized audit framework help or not? And I'd like to add another part to that question too, even though it's already a big question. But it's also a question about the role of governments in either creating a standardized audit format, as Giselle suggests, or even having governments having auditing boards themselves or departments. So would you please speak to that?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so like this is really the strategy of the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK, so ICO. Their strategy has actually been exactly this, where they have, because of GDPR, they have their data enforcement officers, and they have sort of a data protection paradigm that they use for their regulation. And it's sort of this well-funded agency and office. So they're actually able to set up a bunch of internal guidelines around auditing. There are challenges with ICO's approach that I will flag, though, where they're pretty much doing exactly what you said, where they're trying to build internal competency around algorithmic auditing so that as regulators, they can actually maybe go in and do the audits themselves. The issues with that approach is that, for one thing, like I mentioned with external auditors are often preoccupied with whatever group they're representing. So with a regulator, it's a little bit trickier to understand exactly who they represent, and they might not understand, the immigrant, Mexican community of this particular neighborhood is encountering this particular issue, whereas, a grassroots organization or an advocacy group like ACLU that has access to those organizations might be in a better position to actually understand what those concerns are, and then be able to target particular companies or particular products that they know will sort of feed into a broader campaign for justice for that group. So I find that that's something that's very difficult to do as a regulator. And then the other sort of, I guess, critique I have of the ICO's approach to this is, they will release these auditability guidelines where they sort of describe, step by step, like, here's how we approach auditing, and here's sort of, as an internal company, like, if you were to do an audit, here's what we want from you, kind of thing. And really, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of these issues are very contextual. So actually what the regulator should be doing is giving access to a set of external auditors to be able to come in and do their audits, just because it's very tricky as a regulator to understand the full context of a broader injustice happening for a particular community. So rather than sort of coming up with guidelines, there's been this call from grassroots organization, advocacy organizations in the UK to be able to have the regulators provide access. So a regulator mediated access to certain, sample of the data that the company is using to train the model, so that this advocacy group can analyze it. In the case of ACLU, they just sue. So they sued Facebook to get, as part of a settlement of a lawsuit, they'll get data about a particular product. And that's been the ACLU's approach, has just been to sue to get information. But it would be great if there was actually a regulator mediated approach to that. So yeah, I think it's a great question and a great strategy, but my preference, obviously as someone doing external auditing, is to have access.
Fantastic. Mira, would you mind reading the next question?
Yeah, thank you, Deb, for such a fantastic presentation. Our second question says, there are numerous initiatives like the AI for Good, where nonprofits are invited to present problems for AI engineers to solve. What would you say to nonprofits who get approached for that type of initiative and wonder whether it makes sense for them? What should they know or keep in mind?
Yeah, where you're sort of being asked, can I use AI to solve your problem? Yeah, this is, there's been a lot of great articles. I'm thinking of a great article out of Data and Society, and another great article by Ben Green called Good Isn't Good Enough, where he sort of discusses about that objective of good, where the priority should really be the well-being of those affected, not whether or not you get to use AI. So the idea of having, I think the AI for Good initiative is the sort of worthy effort of trying to say, there's all these potential awful things we could do with AI. Can we brainstorm some positive applications of this tool? And I think that's definitely a worthy endeavor for sure. But if it's something that is sort of where you're actively trying to think about, how can I make use of AI versus, oh, I have this problem and AI is the actual best tool to address this problem, then that becomes a very tricky situation, especially since I am obviously a very cynical perspective on this, but I have seen a lot of situations where, because current approaches to AI, really machine learning, are so data hungry, it ends up just being an incredible privacy risk, where people will have to collect lots of information in order to justify, training these models, and it might jeopardize other aspects of the nonprofit's business. So I would just be very careful about that and have a frank conversation about, like, is your priority to use AI or is it to help us? And that will probably reveal motivations. And if they're genuinely interested in helping, then I think there'll be a sort of eager patience on, really reflecting on all the different problems that you might have and how they might be able to help in multiple ways outside of just making use of AI.
Thank you. The next question comes from Poet of Code. So I think we know who that is. A common misconception of the Gender Shades project is that its aim was to improve FRTs. A major contribution was showing how the evaluation paradigms in ML.CV gave us a misleading understanding of system performance. It also equipped advocates to push for context-specific bans and is often cited or referenced in draft legislation. What are other common misconceptions that are associated with audits, accountability, and algorithmic justice?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of misconceptions for sure. I think like that's a great sort of example of the misconception around like I mentioned, the corporate response of just making it better and that being a suitable, sufficient response. I think that there's been a lot of a lot of recent examples of how just improving a facial recognition system is not sufficient. There's a plethora of other issues, some multi-dimensional challenge, so many different ways in which that particular product can go wrong. I think there's also a misconception around the nature of audit outcomes. I think because a lot of the audits that make it into the news are sort of these fairness situations where we're assessing, well, I think there's a couple misconceptions. One is sort of this focus on outcomes, where a lot of the audits that make it into the public eye are these audits where you're looking at a product that's already deployed and you're sort of assessing how well it performs for this particular group or how it disadvantages this particular group. And it's very focused on, outcomes and not necessarily on, what features led to this particular prediction, and are those features the features that we want to contribute to this particular prediction. Whereas you can actually have like a procedural justice audit where you can say, the way, like I mentioned with the SMACTR framework at Google, that was really a lot of what we learned there, where, rather than just auditing the outcome of the model, we can actually audit the process through the model, through which the model was created. We can ask, all these, did you write this document? Did you ask these questions at this point in the development cycle? And really challenging, people across the entire organization to do their due diligence. So that procedural justice approach also counts as an audit, and I don't think a lot of people realize that. There's also this, like I mentioned, a sort of focus on outcomes leads to another misconception around quantitative results. So people are very like, oh, you need a number for it to be an audit. But there's a lot of great work, especially in privacy. And there's actually a recent article I read this morning about Apple's privacy labels, revealing that you can have an audit or an assessment of sort of the state of play for this product's level of privacy by checking particular features, or similar to a model cards approach, just noting particular intentions. And that counts as an assessment, and that counts as an audit. And that's connected to a lot of sort of regulatory proposals around these holistic or qualitative audits. And I don't think a lot of people realize that that's an option for algorithmic auditing.
Thank you. One of our attendees is asking, I'm not technology minded, but I would still like to be an advocate, especially on the legal policy side. How do I get involved? Another question that's similar is, how can we build movements and solidarity to fight against these algorithm-based injustices?
So I didn't catch the first question, the first part of the question.
Yeah, how can someone get involved, especially on the legal or policy side?
Yeah, I think getting involved is potentially tricky depending on the situation, but maybe not. I think it's very easy to get involved from like an advocacy perspective, to join a campaign. The ACLU is still campaigning against facial recognition. There's a lot of important groups. I'm thinking of Hannah Sossaman's MAP group, Twana Petty and Yeshi, who are at Data for Black Lives. There's a lot of organizations that need help, that need support. And it's very easy to get plugged into those organizations, and then through those organizations support their campaigns to change policy, to change regulation. I think that's probably the easiest entryway. And also Algorithmic Justice League, you can sign up and get engaged there as well. So I think there's a lot of different avenues to really participate through these sort of grassroots organizations. I think at a more fundamental level, politically, I'm also noticing a lot of different politicians having this as part of their campaign. So there's also been people, writing letters to, in Canada, you have your MP, but in the States, your representative, and making sure that it's something that they care about. When I was in New York, there was a lot of sort of young people really engaging AOC in this conversation. So there's different ways to sort of politically engage on this topic. And then the other sort of second part of that question around, do I have to sort of like hold the picket line in order to participate in this? I don't think you do. I think there's a lot of different ways people can help. Like I mentioned again, like I think Algorithmic Justice League has a lot of resources and tips on their website on how to learn more and just educate yourself about these topics and all these different organizations. But there's also in my mind also this sort of option for those, especially in this academic space, to really, identify meaningful targets and audit them. So really thinking about some of these questions, like I mentioned, one of the reasons I wanted to skew this presentation towards frustrating elements of, accountability was because I definitely see so many open questions. There's so many things that make it very difficult to really hold people accountable. And if you're in law school, there's a lot of legal frameworks, like I mentioned, around the way anti-discrimination law works being completely incompatible with how like algorithms work. So there's just regardless of what discipline you're in, there's definitely an avenue for you to be able to contribute to the discussion and help think through these issues. And I think that's a worthy way to participate as well.
Thank you so much for sharing all of those different options. And we'll share on our social media also links to the Algorithmic Justice League following this event. And I also like that you plugged Yeshi Milner, who will be speaking later in February, so almost later this month. And we'll also be talking about kind of initiatives within Canada that Data for Black Lives will be working on. So I'm going to combine two questions. So Melissa asks, Melissa would like to know your thoughts on how set up barriers to deployment of models where the idea itself is morally objectionable. And Melissa talks about examples such as predicting sexuality or criminality, and asks, what frameworks might we have for preventing the deployment of these rather than having to rely on recall? And similarly, another audience member also asked about the kind of field of emotion AI, such as Effectiva and such. Thanks.
Yeah, so I think there's been sort of a recent push against effective computing and emotion AI, and there's definitely, I think Kate from AI Now is like on the speakers list somewhere, and she's definitely someone that's quite passionate about this. When I was at AI Now, I learned a lot about how emotion recognition is really a space where scientifically there's a lot up in the air about how effectively you can predict that from a face, especially since, and this is something that I discovered just auditing and looking through different facial recognition data sets. But there's a lot of historically, a lot of the face emotion data sets are actually based off of science that's now moot. So it'll be sort of recycled sort of data sets from like psychology studies, and these are faces that are acted out into 6 categories of emotions, and that is what you feed in as like the training and testing data for a model. So if you're not in this sort of like caricatured like sad face, then it can't predict you as sad. Or if you're not, if you're a completely different ethnicity from 99% of that data set, then it's pretty much a random guess for you. So there's, and like I mentioned and I presented, there's been evidence of bias in effective computing results as well. But yeah, I think there's a lot up in the air about the effectiveness of that whole enterprise. I think there's also sort of related to that is this question of like hireability and criminality from a face. How do we challenge these notions? For one, I think this is really one of those situations where it's actually unethical research, where the claims being made in these papers around being able to detect internal personal states based off of a face is a false claim. And it's a false survival claim, and you can provide evidence that it's not true. So the fact that we're still publishing papers like this is really alarming to me. And I think on a R&D level, it should be shut down before it even gets to the sort of conversation of deployment. So I think, like I mentioned, this is one of the things that frustrated me about auditing is that we're already on the other side of things, usually when things are already deployed. So I'm eager to sort of see situations where, we're able to really challenge the basic assumptions around particular tasks.
Thanks, Deb. Laura is asking, do you see auditing techniques as also useful for model criticism? As you say on feature selection or other aspects of data collection measure, the design choices are significant to the potential of machine learning to succeed without causing harm. How can we support developers to build this mindset and get better at recognizing bad smells for bias or discrimination?
Yeah, I think that there's so I think like I will clarify again, and this is one of the reminders that I had at the beginning, which is that it's not always a consumer choice situation. So I do think there's definitely like teachers that want the best product for their students, but in a lot of cases these are imposed algorithms. It's not I don't have a choice in terms of whether or not the police is using this facial recognition tool on me, for example. But yeah, even from like a procurement element of things or dimensions of things, for sure, there's a lot that we can kind of see as like red flags. I think one is if there's not an evaluation that's like a segregated evaluation across different demographic groups, especially priority groups, that's already a red flag. If there's poor documentation and disclosure, that is definitely a red flag. If there's like hesitance to provide details about different decisions and specifically the data, I think that's definitely something to look out for. The other one is as well, like just representation. So the way that I got into this field was I was, working on training models, and I pulled through a sample, and I'm looking through the sample, and I'm realizing none of the people in any of the images look like me. So even like a quick sort of sampled survey of the data is always a really great way to get a sense of the state of play with a particular product.
Thank you. Also, we're going to have just like one or two final questions just because we're running out of time and we only have the captionist for so long, and also respect your time. But also I hope people can continue these discussions in other spaces and also come to other events where we'll still keep talking about some of these issues. So Blaine asked a question, which is following up on your point that companies have more of an interest in internal auditing when the population affected by an algorithm is the user. Arguably, gig economy workers are algorithm users, but their interests are deprioritized. Do you have any examples of companies who have recognized the interests of every user affected by an algorithm, not just the users whose interests are entirely aligned with the company bottom line?
Yeah, I think that this is a really interesting, especially since the gig worker sort of conversation, and this is I would encourage whoever asked that question to check out the case around Deliveroo's algorithm and the lawsuit that came out of that, because there's a lot of interesting dynamics that play out, especially with gig workers, where they're technically consumers of the algorithm, but they're also employees or contractors, if you want to use the sort of legal term for it. And as workers, they have particular rights that I think position them in it. That puts them in an interesting position to really demand, from the employer, from who usually ends up being sort of the manufacturer of the algorithm or the vendor of the algorithm, to to have their best interests or their well-being to heart as part of their obligation as an employer, and not just the vendor of the algorithm they're making use of. So I do think the dynamic with gig workers is very fascinating. I think there's a lot of great work happening in that space. I'm not very familiar with. I know Meredith Whitaker at AI Now is one of the people that's very interested in this topic, and maybe able to, through her Twitter page, probably direct you to other people. But I do know that this is something that, especially post November 3rd, where Prop 22 in California was rejected, and that was sort of an opportunity for gig workers to assert themselves, legally as workers, as full-time, employees. So, there's a lot of conversation post Prop 22 about their status as not just users, but like I mentioned, as workers with particular worker rights, and how that changes the dynamic and the obligations, and thus the accountability of those building the algorithms to control their schedule and control their time. In general, though, worker surveillance is a great sort of interesting domain to look into. There's a prof at Columbia that's done a lot of really interesting work. And Microsoft too has now been starting to do a lot of interesting work, sort of questioning the ethics of worker surveillance and algorithms used by employers to sort of monitor and control the time of different workers. So I agree with you. It's a very different dynamic from the regular user or the regular consumer. Yeah, it's definitely worth it to frame things appropriately in that context.
Thank you.
Yeah, so another question that we have says, some of your slides presented issues with algorithmic accountability in a criminal justice context. As you discussed, one of the key issues with algorithms aimed at sentencing to predict recidivism as biased data sets. Do you see a path for limiting the types of information available to corporations marketing these types of tools? Do you think legal ideas of privacy pose problems for such data?
Sorry, what was the question? Is around, do I think that privacy poses problems for, I didn't quite get the question.
Oh, yeah, sure. So do you see a path for limiting the types of information available to corporations marketing these types of tools?
Oh, yeah. So I think, and this is maybe something that I can definitely rant about, where the sort of power dynamics involved in the data hoarding of the data hoarding aspect of machine learning is incredible, especially when it comes to biometric data that's very sensitive, such as with facial recognition. I think that for me is really probably an equal, if not more important challenge with facial recognition is this issue that the dominant paradigm for developing these tools currently is deep learning, and deep learning has this huge data cost. And as a result of that, you'll have these companies with and this was really exposed with Clearview AI, which ended up being kind of the Clearview AI ended up sort of being the exposed rat of the industry. But there's a lot of other companies. NEC is a company, Cognitech is another company. These are companies you guys probably are like, what are these companies? They're not public, they're not publicly known, but there's a lot of other companies, just like Clearview, that have these repositories of millions of individuals' faces. And that's like having, that's as creepy as having, someone's fingerprint. It's very sensitive information to have someone's face data. And these companies have these huge repositories, lots and, large amounts of data under their control, with very little regulation. One, in terms of how they store it. And we saw this with Clearview, where once the New York Times story with Clearview AI, which was a company that was, sourcing face data from social media and hoarding that. There was a situation with Clearview where they actually got hacked because their security system wasn't very effective. So that information is now vulnerable for other people to be able to access and use for whatever they want. So the security risk there is very real, but then also more, I guess, more important or equally important is the privacy and consent risk, where you have, this information of other people that you're using without their consent to develop your product, and in a way that could affect them without their understanding or without their consent. So yeah, I definitely see that as a huge challenge. I do recognize though that this is one of those situations where, like I was mentioning, there's sort of these three challenges, and one of them is, the people that build the algorithms versus the people making use of the algorithms. I find that when it comes to a lot of the privacy lawsuits, BIPA is this legislation in Illinois that prevents companies from, storing biometric data of individuals, and it's really the only sort of legal tool I've seen that's been effective in addressing this privacy issue at the point of the person, creating the algorithms. So under BIPA, Facebook, who by the way, Facebook in 2014, trained the first deep learning face model because they had the largest private face data set. They have so many faces. It's the name is not a coincidence. So Facebook was a situation where they were actually hoarding, they're hoarding face data effectively, and BIPA was actually able to be a legal clause for a mass lawsuit against Facebook, and they were able to settle at a ridiculous amount. So I think BIPA is sort of one of the few legal sort of frameworks I've seen that have been effective at really getting at some of these companies that have just gotten away with for so long hoarding massive amounts of people's sensitive biometric information for the sake of training a model. I think the more common case with respect to privacy lawsuits though is with the operator. So the person that might be collecting faces to use to test their facial recognition model on, or test a vendor product on, or use a vendor product on someone's face without consent to make a prediction about their face. Those are probably a more likely sort of like legal case. But I think the question around these companies developing these facial recognition tools actually also having a bunch of face data is a very valid question. And I think it's definitely something that should be more discussed in legislation.
Thank you. I will have one final question just because we have to wrap up with the captionists and everything. But there's a question about whether or not, or how concerned citizens can actually take part in this kind of auditing process, in terms of, maybe people don't necessarily have the technological abilities, but would it be so like, how can you vet AI and ML as a concerned citizen, and especially maybe in the role of like purchasing products that may also be relying on these kinds of technologies?
How can we, sorry, I'm like,
no worries. No, it's been really long. But like, how can a concerned, how can you vet AI and ML as a concerned citizen? And this might really, how can you vet like,
okay. Yeah.
AI and ML as a concerned citizen?
Yeah. Yeah, like I mentioned, there's a lot of different ways to participate and to get involved. Through different grassroots organizations, if you sort of want to actively participate in the pushback of these tools. I think in terms of understanding it as a concerned citizen, there's a lot of challenges. The press is not doing anyone any favors usually. I was actually just tweeting today though, I really like, if people are interested in sort of following different stories, like I think Kari Johnson at VentureBeat has been doing a really excellent job covering this sort of beat on AI bias issues and tracking down some of these lawsuits if people want to stay informed. Karen Howe at MIT Tech Review is also a really great reporter. I think David Gershom at 10 on Medium is also really sort of, these are reporters on the beat, and they sort of have been in the community or have been around long enough for them to not fall for a lot of hype that I think other reporters kind of fall prey to. So yeah, I think understanding the couple reporters that are sort of well-seasoned voices on these topics, or even researchers. I think, Joy's a great researcher to follow that has definitely been keeping track of the conversation, the national conversation on these issues. So I feel like there's certain researchers and reporters that have really that are tracking this conversation and are worth sort of learning from. And that might just be the first step in this, is just to pay attention to what those experts are saying and really just keep track of what's going on, so that when it's, you know, your time to vote for something, as in the case of, you know, Prop 22 or other opportunities, to really, you know, contribute your voice in terms of changing a legislative outcome, you're informed about the context of that outcome and you know what's going on. So I'd encourage people to really stay informed first. As a concerned citizen, that's probably the first thing to do and the best thing to do.
Thank you so much. And I think Joy wrote Crash Project as well. But we have to wrap up now because we can't go over time. But thank you so much. And thank you so much for everyone who is here. If you want to rewatch, it'll be on our website within the next week. If you had friends or colleagues. Oh,
I was going to say, yeah, I have to give this shout out because Joy just wrote it. But AJL has this Crash Project where effectively we're thinking about how to sort of identify and discover these harms. So through AJL, there's opportunities too, if you kind of feel like you've experienced some level of algorithmic injustice, to actually engage with the organization and report that, and also sort of work with the team to understand how to educate yourself on some of these issues. So that's part of what AJL's sort of mission is, and this Crash Project is really the locus of a lot of that effort. I just wanted to do justice and that shout out. Thanks for the reminder, Joy.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming. Come to our future events. We really appreciate everyone being here, and have a great evening. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.